The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for the purposes of asking questions of today's witnesses. In today's testimony, we heard about the growing number of, quote, green, unquote, end quote, claims made about household products. Dr. Combs told us about a, quote, virtual tsunami, end quote, of these claims, and Mrs. Rangan used the term, quote, green noise, end quote, to talk about the conflicting, confusing, and overabundant information in the marketplace. And I want to start with a question for the entire panel regarding the types of information that green labels should provide to consumers. There appear to be so many expectations for what these labels cover. Environmental impacts of the packaging or the products itself, the possible health impacts of the products on individuals, among others. The question for each one of the panelists is this: what is reasonable for consumers to expect from these labels, and what is beyond the scope of green labeling? More simply, what should it mean for a product to be green? I'd like to begin with Dr. Combs. What is it reasonable for consumers to expect for these labels to cover?
Chairman, we look at this in a way that would turn your question around. We look first at what a reasonable consumer expects, and then we require marketers to meet that expectation. So the question for us is, what does the label convey to a reasonable consumer? And then the marketer has to meet whatever that reasonable interpretation is. Obviously, that's obviously that's a problem, as you indicated, given the breadth of these kinds of claims and the fact that they cut across virtually every market sector. It's very challenging to have one label that meets all those expectations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the challenge here is that it's almost impossible to determine what a reasonable expectation is. I think what we can do, however, is require that any manufacturer making an environmental claim publicly provides proof of the accuracy of that claim, and that any label on a product that suggests green in some sort of broader sense clearly define what tests were required to meet the eligibility requirements for that label. So basically it boils down to greater transparency so that consumers have the information they need to evaluate products.
I agree completely with Mr. Case. I think the first question is, what is the key material impact of the product? What matters most? And we use a tool called life cycle assessment to determine what really matters in evaluating a product's environmental or social or health impact. And the second is there full transparency on those impact categories? So the ideal product label would tell you information on what actually matters in that product. So we see products, including in the foyer to this committee hearing, that are claiming they are environmentally sensitive products, but they're not disclosing what really matters in this product to the environment, to whether there's chemicals that are bioaccumulative or toxic to human health or the environment. That's the information for each product. If we're looking at electronics, we want to know, does the company have a good take-back program to reduce the end-of-life impact of the product? If it's apparel, it's a different set of issues. Right now, our big problem is that companies can claim anything, whether it's irrelevant to the main impact category or not, and not disclose the underlying information, the ingredients or the performance which makes up the real impact to the environment and human health.
I think it's a very good question. I think the FTC already has some tools available to it. One is called the Pfizer Doctrine, which says that if you make a claim, you had better be able to substantiate it. There's also what's called material information, that consumers have the right to certain material information for them to be able to make an informed choice. And that actually was developed with a series of letters between then Chairman Dingell and the FTC back in the early 80s. I think what you have, a lot of members here have talked about, is sort of the baseline that you need, that you should not be able to go below that if you're going to be able to make a claim. Now, how you define that is something that I think we could all work on, but I think that's not a bad starting point. I think you also have to recognize that the FTC really is sort of in the position of saying, first, do no harm, making sure that whatever claim you do make, that it is credible, that it's accurate. I think there also, though, there's a need to look at proactive efforts. In other words, we want to get the marketplace to expand beyond just the baseline. We want to make this a competitive advantage, a true competitive advantage, where people are constantly looking for new ways of improving their score on environmental issues. I mean, that should be a sort of a positive incentive that we want to create. So I think there's a lot of balances that have to be in the mix here, but I think they all can be part of if we have sort of a consensus process that we try to develop.
Thank you. I agree with most of what this panel has said, and would just add that consumers are often faced with a premium when they're choosing among these labels. And so it takes more than just being truthful. It actually has to have some meaning. And so when you see the no CFC label, for example, on an aerosol, typical personal care product or cleaning aerosol product, that's the law. You can't have CFCs. And yet manufacturers use that claim without any other disclosure that, in fact, that's what all products in that category have to meet. So to disclaim a lack of value over the baseline or products would be very important in terms of being truthful and not deceptive to consumers. And then in terms of just to capture something that was just said about marketplace capture, these premium labels shouldn't be able to be met by most of the marketplace. They should be reserved for a top tier, and that in and of itself should drive innovation within a product sector to meet those standards. In Japan, there's a program called the Roadrunner Standard, which in their energy efficiency standards, I can't remember the number, but it's a certain small percentage of the market that can meet it. That's expected to be the bottom a few years later. And again, you slice it off at 10% who can meet the high premium label standards. So creating incentives and innovation like that in the green marketplace will also drive the industry to create the innovation to meet higher standards.
The chair's term is concluded. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Radonovich, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome. I enjoyed the testimony of all the members. Glad you made it, Dr. Rangan. And I would like to start off with a couple of questions. One for Mr. Case. Appreciated your testimony in trying to define what's green and what's not. Do you believe a regulated product with a chemical in it could be defined green?
Most products have chemicals in them, so absolutely, yes. So
Okay.
there are, in fact, greener chemical-based products.
Okay. Question for the whole panel then, as we're trying to define what green is. If you were to define it, would you limit its definition to biodegradability and life cycle carbon footprint alone, or would you add other things to that definition? And I'll just go down the line and say you got those two things, biodegradability and life cycle carbon footprint. What would you add to that if that wasn't sufficient to you?
Well, what the commission has said, Congressman, is that general environmental claims like green or eco-friendly aren't very useful and can be deceptive because they mean.
But what would you add to those two? If you had
Well-
two things, what would you add?
Well, what
in
we
addition
would do is look at how consumers interpret a claim in context and not add.
Could you just, because I got to go down the line, and I don't mean to be rude,
Right.
don't take it the wrong way, but if you just had those two things, biodegradability and life cycle carbon footprint as the definition of what you'd label green, if you think that's not sufficient, what short responses would you add to it?
I think you would have to add many, many claims depending on how a consumer would interpret something in context.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Case?
So obviously you would need to take a look at all of the environmental impacts throughout the product's entire life cycle, from the raw materials that are used all the way through. So you didn't mention, for example, energy efficiency.
Okay.
You didn't mention water efficiency. You didn't mention low toxicity. You didn't mention how one defines biodegradability. I see the smile, I'll stop there.
You could-
But we could
Well,
go
good.
on all afternoon listing the various environmental attributes, depending on the product category, as Dr. O'Rourke mentioned.
Okay.
The standards will be different for
Thanks.
computer products than cleaning.
I'm working down the list here. Dr. O'Rourke?
Right. I also agree that we should be using life cycle approaches to understand the real impact across from raw material extraction to manufacturing to use to disposal. For consumer products, the things I would add to your short list are persistence, is it bioaccumulative, and is it toxic to human health or the environment? I would add those on top of yours.
Okay. Dr. Cooper? Mr. Cooper, excuse me.
Thank you. Don't have that other degree. When I worked for this subcommittee back in the early 90s, the jurisdiction was not only consumer affairs, it was also RCRA and Superfund, and so the issues
I'm sorry, I
then-
need to get you on the question, though, because if you had biodegradability and life cycle carbon footprint defining what was green, what else? If that was
the
insufficient,
issues
would you
that
add to
were
it?
front and center for the subcommittee then were recyclability, post-consumer waste, a lot of issues around the whole recycling mandate. So those were the ones I would add to it at this
Thank
point.
you. Thank you, Dr. Cooper. And Mr. Cooper, Dr. Wright.
I agree with again, most of what was said. I would stress the health aspect of it, whether it's persistence or toxicity. And I'd also add social responsibility, whether fair trade is the common term that people talk about. And there's there's plenty of Venn diagrams about sustainability, but you'd be amazed and almost shock and awed as to the multiple attributes that you could consider in any kind of green marketing claim.
All right. Question for everybody, too. Should government dictate the process of a manufacturing of a product or the makeup of a product in order to be able to get some kind of a green designation?
That would certainly not be within the FTC's purview.
Okay.
And absolutely not. These are not prescriptive. What we're doing instead is identifying what environmental leadership looks like, and some people will make an awful lot of money meeting those high standards.
Okay.
I think that the key here is transparency, that Congress requires public disclosure of what's actually in these products, and just through making that public alone, not mandating what's in it, how it's made, just mandating the disclosure and the transparency will create incentives for leading firms to innovate and other firms to change their products.
We like the public-private model. The Underwriters Laboratory is a member of ANSI. The UL label is seen everywhere. In fact, it's in the energy bill. So I think that model, could work in this area as well.
My answer is a little different. I think where there are common terms, that baseline definitions should be provided. If we're going to continue to allow natural to be used and widely, we ought to have some baselines as to what that ought to mean. And in food, there's a plethora of examples where we have really common, even discrete terms like no antibiotics, and yet that doesn't have to mean the same thing from product to product. So yes, we think there is a role for the government to play in providing some baseline definitions to some of the claims out there.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was curious, as you look at this, the challenge of this kind of labeling, the sort of transparency and labeling regime that we're trying to bring to bear with respect to green products, is there any analogous labeling challenge you would point to over and above some of the others to kind of be a frame of reference for this? Or is this kind of, does this have some unique dimensions to it that we ought to be aware of? So I just asked anybody to jump into that.
Even within the government, there's a number of labeling programs at sort of varying levels of maturity. And even you have Energy Star, which is one of the oldest ones. You have Organic, which is now pretty mature. And there's a lot of learning lessons to be had from both the way the model is set up in terms of how the labeling programs are run, how they're overseen, and how the standards evolve or don't evolve over time. And so there are a lot of lessons to be learned, and there's a lot of variation in quality among even the government-based labeling programs.
Anybody else want to try?
Sure. I will say that there are a number of excellent standard-setting protocols that are out there. ANSI runs a wonderful program. There are ISO programs that define how environmental leadership should be established. So those are very, very useful. And what I really like is the USDA organic model, because what they did is they took a confusing space with dozens of different standards for organic and group them under one label, and that's what allowed the organic farmers in this country to really make a lot of money, because that provided clarity and a single brand for consumers to look for.
Well, it occurred to me the organic example would be a good one to consult, or the organic experience with that kind of labeling would be a good one to consult, but I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Yeah.
I might add a quite different experience, which is in financial disclosure and the role of the Securities and Exchange Commission in requiring disclosure of key material information from companies. I think that we're moving towards, a system that would require disclosure of non-financial metrics from companies in standard formats through XBRL or other formats that would allow people, either analysts or consumers, to evaluate products and the companies more accurately. So just as we've had this problem with toxic assets over the last few years, we are realizing we're having problems with toxic products where people would not buy them if they knew what was really in them.
And let me ask this question. I think, Dr. O'Rourke, you're the one that founded Good Guide, is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. Which is an online resource for people to kind of check on the claims.
That's right.
And what I was curious about is how you see the service you provide relating to the level of kind of government regulation that needs to be in this area. In other words, do you view what you're doing largely now as just being a compensator for the absence of some good other oversight and transparency mechanisms, or do you see the potential, whatever we achieve in that regard, to be a kind of partner in the effort and achieve a higher level of accountability across the board?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. We basically begun Good Guide out of this huge gap in the information available to consumers, and it really was an attempt just to fill this hole and get people information that they were desiring about health, environmental, social impacts of products. We're now working closely with the state of California, and hopefully we would be very excited about working with the federal government about getting better information out, required disclosure of this key information that would allow the public to get this information in a standard format. I think over the long term there's a huge and vital role for government in facilitating better communication of information out to the public. And this small project, Good Guide, is really an attempt to learn what information does the public want and in what form is it most effective in helping them make better decisions in the marketplace.
This is an off-the-wall question, but have there been any ideas about a technology that would allow consumers, as they move through a store, for example, on their phone or some other device, to scan right there and go straight to a consumer guide? Did you already talk about that?
No, but
Okay.
we have actually built that software at Good Guide, and we have the ability to scan barcodes. We're looking at RFID tagging of products, and over time what we want to do is allow people in stores to get the best available information in the world on products and companies so that they can make better decisions for themselves and not have to depend on marketing or packaged claims, but they can get scientific information on these products.
Okay, thank you.
And Good Guide's actually not the only company that is doing it. There are dozens of companies that have approached us saying, hey, we've got the technology, we just need the information. And what's lacking is, how do you define this as a green product? Because we've got the technology. It's the definition we need.
Thank you. I yield my time back.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Stupak, for 5 minutes for the purposes of questioning the witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry I couldn't be here for all the hearing. I've been in and out with other hearings and other matters. Mr. Cooper, let me ask this question because I want to know more about these standards, because I support the scientific rigor and the transparent process that the American National Standards Institute requires of any organization seeking accreditation as an ANSI standards development organization. My understanding is that there are 3 primary green building certification systems in the marketplace: Green Globes, LEED, and the National Association of Home Builders National Green Building Standard. Can you discuss for us whether the organizations that develop these standards are ANSI standards development organizations, and whether they use your approved procedures to develop these standards? Because what I hear everybody saying, they're all talking about different standards, but who's regulating the standards, in a way?
There are multiple paths, which makes it a little bit more complicated. but every one of those codes you mentioned does fall under the ANSI rubric. Some of those will have their own approaches, say like the ICC, International Code Council,
Right.
who works very closely with local units of government. So it's not quite the consensus process that we have for most of our standards because it's only with the local units of government that they interact with. Usually we insist that it's a much more ecumenical group, including consumer groups or government agencies as well at the federal or local level. So each one of those can approach differently, but every one of them has to meet basic ANSI standards of transparency, of involving the interested parties. They have to be able to respond to questions of inclusion. And then if they want to become an ANS standard, then there's a whole other level of involvement with ANSI. If they then want to become an international standard, there's a whole other level with ISO.
Right.
So there's sort of belts and suspenders on each one of these. And against the standard, you also have all the obligations for the conformance, the testing and inspection, the measurement, which is not only the certification, which we don't do, but say like a UL would do, but then we would accredit the UL so that we're looking at the testers. So there are levels of these things, and partly because we are not a government agency, we have to overcompensate for these things. Our job in most any other country would be done by a government agency.
Does anyone care to comment on it any further? Let me ask this one then, Mr. Cohn. The FTC is announcing today 3 complaints alleging false and misleading claims regarding environmental claims. Despite today's discussion of a vast array of misleading green claims on products, 3 is a very small number of enforcement actions. So can you describe the FTC's approach to enforcement in this area, and under what circumstances do you turn to enforcement of some standards?
Well, we turn to enforcement when it's necessary, and we use enforcement not only to get people under order and to have an effect on the people who are violating the law, but also to lay out a marker for those people who might otherwise violate the law. And the hope is that in bringing cases in certain areas that we will have an effect well beyond the cases that we bring.
Do you work with state governments to do enforcement at the more local levels?
Well, we bring national enforcement action.
Right.
We regularly work with state partners and with other federal agencies. For example, in at least one of these cases, EPA is helping with expert testimony.
Do you, what's your tipping point? When do you actually bring enforcement standards? I mean, do you work with these industries and companies? And when do you actually, what's the point where you turn to enforcement?
Well, it's different in each circumstance. That we regularly work with companies. We work with various associations to try and get the word out. When that isn't working, or when people step way over the line, then enforcement is necessary. There's kind of 2 folks we deal with, the folks that step over the line and the people who live over the line. And for the people who are committing fraud and living over the line, like the cases I mentioned for car devices, one of them is called a nano detonator that runs on nuclear fusion. It would be about 100 million degrees. That if it actually worked, those people need to be sued. And the Commission's been quite active, bringing 8 cases over the last year, and I would expect more in the future.
Okay. Does anyone else care to comment on that? What you see FTC roles in enforcement while at the same time trying to set standards? Mr. Case?
My challenge is that when the enforcement action occurs after consumers have been defrauded, that, I'm stuck at this point with a $2,500 refrigerator that doesn't even come close to meeting the Energy Star standard. So these, allowing companies to make claims without requiring them to provide proof, so that as a consumer, I know the claim is accurate before the purchase, is sinful.
Yeah, but how do you do it until they advertise we have some victims, right?
Well, one of the things that you can do is actually require that if you're going to be making an environmental claim, that you have to post information providing evidence that the claim is accurate, so that as a consumer I could stand there in the store with my phone and go online and see, yes, this claim is accurate.
So until we get Mr. Sarbanes' idea ginned up on your cell phone, we have to have something else at the posting prior to the time of sale. That's what you're saying.
And in the example that Mr. Case used about the refrigerator, it was actually Consumer Reports test
Right.
of Energy Star and the energy standards that showed that the standards don't capture what the problems are out there. If you can turn off the ice maker and you can turn off all the bells and whistles of a refrigerator and test it for energy consumption, but when you turn them all on, it's doubled, that's not good enough. And it just highlights again how standards, and in this case, a government labeling program standard, needs to evolve over time, and where we would like to see more FTC involvement in making sure that those claims are truthful and meaningful over time for consumers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks the gentleman. The chair would like to inform the witnesses and the members of the subcommittee that he intends to allow for a second round of questioning. So if the witnesses could please let us use a little bit more of your time for a second round of questions, and we will have a second round of questioning. The chair recognizes himself for 2 minutes for the purposes of asking additional questions. Mr. Combe, well, all the witnesses, this has been some very interesting testimony, some quite provocative, I might add. One of the questions that I wanted to ask Mr. Combe, you talked about your enforcement actions, and you did not reference at all the green guides when you said that alleged that the companies stepped over the lines. So let's get back to this place of the green guides. I think this is very important. What place should the green guides have in the future of the future enforcement cases? Should that be a beginning, or how should that green guide inform future enforcement actions?
Well, Chairman, I think the green guides are incredibly important. That one of the things the green guides are intended to do is demarcate that line so that the people who are trying to stay on the right side more easily can do so. That there are some people who step over because they don't know where the line is, and we can make that line clearer. There's some people who step over because the whole marketplace starts to go over the line, and that's where we need to take enforcement action to make clear where that line is, and that's one of the things we did today.
Do any of the other witnesses want to respond about the importance or lack thereof of the green guides?
Yeah, I'll support Mr. Combe. I think that absolutely when the original green guides came out in '92, we saw lots of additional clarity in the marketplace about what was acceptable and what wasn't, again with the revisions in '98, '99. And what we're hopeful is that the next version of the guides actually provides a much more comprehensive assessment and really kind of requires people to provide proof, requires people to provide some clarity on these issues, and make sure that as consumers we know whether the information is accurate, relevant, and verifiable.
We also support the green marketing guides by the FTC, and we also look forward to the update because they could be expanded to be much more broad in terms of the scope of claims that they're covering and much more detailed in terms of what's acceptable and what isn't.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, and the chair wants to clarify before the ranking member begins his question. It's been requested by the ranking member and by the Republican side that we have 5 minutes of additional questions. And the chair said it'll be 2 minutes. So the chair will recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes, recognize Mr. Stupak for an additional 5 minutes, and then the chair will come back for his other 3 minutes. Okay? So with that, the chair recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes of additional questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the openness to try to answer as many questions as we can and get a benefit from this panel of speakers. Mr. O'Rourke, you had mentioned something in your testimony that consumers have little information on critical aspects of a product, and it reminds me of getting up in the middle of the night needing an aspirin or something and trying to go through what's on the back of an aspirin label, and you search for the dosage because you want to take the correct amount, oh my gosh, it's not on the first page. You have to peel back to get to the second page. And there's so much garbage on that label that really all what you're looking for is the dosage. And I guess my question is, how much information can you expect to give a consumer on a label, and how much of this is subject to buyer beware?
Yeah, so we're seeing, I think more and more consumers are looking for some key pieces of information when they look at products. So in your case, it was the dosage or the directions on how many you should take. When I look at a green cleaner, I want to know, are there specific chemicals of concern that I don't want in my house, in the air, on the dishes, wherever, personal care products that I don't want certain chemicals. And what I think the first step is deciding what are the key pieces of information that need to go on that label that are most pertinent to protecting people's health and the environment. If there is too much information, then what we're proposing is that it needs to be disclosed on the manufacturer's website. So we're seeing right now in the household cleaners area that there is not a federal mandate to disclose all the ingredients in your floor cleaner, your toilet bowl cleaner. Some of the harshest chemicals in your house, they're not disclosed on the package. What we would like is that they would be disclosed somewhere, either on the manufacturer's website or ultimately on the package. So I think that for things like that, you're putting a harsh chemical in your house. I don't think you can put it on the consumer to just be buyer beware. I think that they need certain pieces of information to know how to protect themselves from chemicals.
Could you clarify to me, it's my understanding that the Federal Hazardous Substance Act requires all that to be on there?
No, so on household chemical products in the U.S., there's a requirement of disclosure of certain active ingredients over certain percentages. So if you go back home tonight and look in your bathroom or underneath your sink, most of the harshest chemicals you'll find in your house will have either 1 ingredient listed or 0 ingredients listed. Whereas if you look at your personal care products, your liquid hand soap, the requirement is all ingredients in order of concentration. So your liquid hand soap will have 30 ingredients listed, and your tub and tile cleaner will have 0, 1, or maybe 2 at the most. And what they will do is say either call it inactive ingredients, or they'll dilute them enough that they don't have to disclose. So you will literally have no ingredients listed. And sometimes we'll have phrases like fragrance, as I mentioned, which just masks ingredients.
Right, okay.
So unfortunately, we don't have accurate disclosure on chemicals in our houses.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Case, I want to ask a second question here. You mentioned that the labeling program at the USDA dealing with organic foods, and as you know, the USDA website states that it's not a health or environmental program, but it's really a marketing program, and yet many people think that buying products with organic labels on them are somehow getting a health or environmental benefit. If transparency about the products and their manufacture are what you seek, why do you hold up a program that relies on implied but not guaranteed benefits as your model?
What the USDA organic program does is actually bring clarity to the market. So for those consumers that are concerned with the pesticides that are used on fields, with the farming technologies and techniques, worries about pesticides on food, what the USDA organic label does is provide a consistent platform for consumers to make educated comparisons between an organic product and a non-organic product. So what it does is provide a common definition, a litmus test, if you will.
All right, thank you very much. Dr. Rangan, you suggested other factors such as fair trade should be included in green labeling, but many of the environmental practices in fair trade countries is not up to U.S. standards. Is that useful to the consumer?
The International Labor Organization, ILO, is a good start. That's where Transfair bases their fair trade labeling program and their standards from, and it's a good international labeling start for fair practices. Do you mind if I just expand on your organic question for 1 minute?
Like.
Which is that there are cases where consumers rightfully infer that organic may offer them a healthier alternative. And I'll just give you an example. When Mad Cow came out, organic was one of the few programs that actually required no animal byproducts in the feed. So is it a healthier alternative? Well, when it comes to Mad Cow, yes, it was an alternative if you still wanted to eat beef that minimized your potential exposure. And then that's the inadvertent side of health and benefit from organic. But on the advertent side, all the materials used in organic production have to be reviewed by the National Organic Standards Boards, and health and safety are components that have to be addressed in that review process. It happens to be based in Agricultural Marketing Service, and after 10 years of watchdogging that program, we hear that mantra, we're not anything else but marketing, but I think that has more to do with where it lives than what it actually is.
All right. Thank you very much, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The chair thanks the gentleman. The chair now recognizes Mrs. Stupak for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think what I've taken from this hearing so far is that what constitutes green can be sort of a tricky business. But as we see the global supply chain get farther and farther removed from the everyday consumer, we're using more and more fossil fuels. So let me give you an example, because I think we mentioned cleaners in that today. We have green cleaners, or cleaners made basically from the same chemicals as always, but they're purchased from a closer distance. So the companies are saying, well, we're a greener chemical because we're not using as much fossil fuel to transport. Now, does this fact alone, I use less fuel to transport the product, qualify a product to be a green product? Anyone want to answer that, Dr. O'Rourke?
I would say the short answer is no. What we need to do is evaluate the full life cycle of that product and determine whether transport or manufacturing process is highly energy inefficient and that it is a major impact category. For a few products, energy use and transport matter a lot, and for other products, they don't matter that much. So you really need to know, does it matter to the product category? What we are seeing now in many cleaners is the claim that they are plant-based rather than petroleum-based.
Okay.
Again, that may actually be a confusing concept, because what they're doing is deriving a chemical from a plant, like sodium lauryl sulfate. It can also be derived from petroleum. So the same chemical ends up in your product, it's just derived from a different source. So the key is finding out what really matters to environmental or health effects on these things, and is that claim, can you verify or can you back up that claim with transparent information?
Well, give me an example where transportation costs alone would qualify it to be green, that use less transportation costs. I mean,
there are a few product categories in which transport of the product, really long distances, heavy products. So, for instance, air shipping products a long way has a very high energy impact. So if you see something that was either grown in a greenhouse or flown to you, that's probably going to have a very high energy impact, and it's going to matter. So we see now more and more people in the U.S. looking for locally produced food for that reason, that they want local, which reduces the big transportation chain, the big energy. But there are many products in which the transport is a minor impact category.
well, couldn't you make that claim then on any waterborne product, basically? Water, from iron ore pellets from northern Michigan down to the steel mills. That's the only way you can transport it. It's the most efficient way and less fuel, or even cars coming across the ocean because of the size and the weight and the bulk. I would think there'd have to be more to it than just transportation.
That's right, that's right. Air travel's the highest carbon intensity. Shipping is actually quite efficient carbon-wise. Train transport quite efficient carbon-wise. Local production the most efficient. So there's a range of impacts, and you need to understand those things to be able to either evaluate it or make the claim. Another thing we're seeing a lot of bottled water. For instance, one bottled water company shipped from the South Pacific and claiming it's a green bottled water company. Huge transport and energy impacts of the manufacture and transport of that product. And then it's got a beautiful green label and an eco bottle in which it's sold. We view that as confusing at best, deceptive at worst.
Dr. Ranga, do you want to say something on that?
I think that in talking about the sphere of green, there's a top and a bottom and sides, and if we're establishing a floor or talking about that floor, at the very least, disclosure and truthfulness to the meaning should be there, so that if a company is making a carbon claim that either they use recyclable energy, wind energy to generate a product, those aren't void of value. They have some value, but the claim should reflect what they're doing. Should a carbon claim be interpreted as a health claim? It shouldn't be. And our advice to consumers is always read these claims quite literally. And it's also why we continue to say that discrete labels right now in the marketplace offer consumers the quickest way to understand what a product is. So if you need to group discrete claims together in order to explain the many attributes of green a product may have, then so be it. We prefer that method, at least right now, versus an overarching label where it's very difficult to tell the variations in the components.
Mr. Cooper? You got to turn that on, your mic on.
That you have a Gresham's law in effect here, that bad labels are going to drive the good labels out of the marketplace. So I think you first do no harm. I think, though, one of the points that Dr. Rangan make about, say, in Japan, where you have an effort to sort of up the ante, where you're looking for constantly improving the product, is something that I think that we should also consider as part of this mix, that you want to have companies who actually have a role to play in sort of being the pathfinders, where you're constantly improving the products. Getting that sort of seal or label recognized is not going to be easy, but when it is, say like a Good Housekeeping,
right, or
a Business Bureau or Underwriters Laboratory, then it's a very powerful tool. So I think that should be part of the mix as well.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Looks like my time's expired. Thanks for the second round.
Thank you. The chair recognizes himself for his claim his 3 minutes. You mentioned water. I mean, somebody tell me about the false labeling that is involved with water. I got a bottle of water here. It says smaller labels equal more trees. And it also under that says we could write more on a bigger label, but saving trees is important, which we understand and we agree with. By keeping it short, we've saved almost 10 million pounds of paper per year in the U.S. That's about 30,000 trees. And then it says, be green. And I just want to know, first of all, this is a label, but also this stuff, some of this stuff is nothing but tap water in a bottle. All right, but yet consumers buy the water because it's a part of being green and being healthy and that type of thing. Can you all respond to that and help us to help deliver the American consumer from the trap that they find themselves in?
Chairman Rush, you have just highlighted in that bottle what the problems are. Because there aren't baselines for what should be disclosed or not disclosed, it's up to a company to decide what they feel like disclosing, and what they don't feel like disclosing, they can weave that into a green claim and say we're using less paper and less disclosure is less paper. And in terms of the water inside the bottle, absolutely. Our tests have shown year after year, if you filter your water, you're going to get as good of quality with regard to health as anything that's in one of those bottles. I think this is a great example of where the baseline has a lot of holes, and in filling those holes and getting rid of these generic claims that are vague and meaningless, we can do a lot toward reducing the confusion that comes from that bottle and a consumer trying to buy it.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. It is, in some circumstances, a legitimate claim. Under the 7 sins taxonomy, though, we would refer to it as the sin of the hidden trade-off. What manufacturers are able to do with almost any product that you make is find some little nugget that allows them to say, oh, this makes it green. And so the question is, well, how many nuggets are acceptable? At what point does it become green? And so what one needs is some sort of voluntary environmental label so that there are actual standards that say, this is what green is. And if you have products that meet a standard developed in an open, public, transparent process, you'll be able to resolve those kinds of issues. And so it would be open to these kind of standard-setting committees whether those kinds of claims are worthy of some sort of national label.
Smile.
Chairman, those are fairly specific claims, and those are claims that, if true, a consumer can understand and make choices based on. That a lot of the discussion today has been about these general green claims, that I'm green, I'm eco-friendly, that are very difficult to substantiate. But if assuming all those claims are true and a consumer wanted to contribute to using less paper, and assuming they didn't take any implied claim from that about the water, that those are useful claims.
Yeah, the problem with those claims is that they're completely irrelevant to the actual environmental impact or health impact of that product. So it may be an accurate claim, but it is, in a sense, a kind of magician's bait and switch, where you're looking at one hand and the real action is in the other hand. For that product, it's around the manufacturing of the water, the manufacturing of the plastic bottle, and the disposal of the plastic bottle are the real environmental impacts, not the little tiny piece of paper around the sleeve of the plastic. So their claim may be accurate, but it is largely irrelevant to the actual environmental and health impact of the product.
Well, and that concludes our hearing today, and I want to really relay to our witnesses. I have not had a greater panel of witnesses to help us on any issue that I can think of since I've been chairman of the subcommittee. You've been outstanding, and your testimony has been very, very informative and provocative and very interesting. And I really want to thank each and every one of you for participating. And I think that you made this subcommittee, much more prepared to deal with this particular issue. And I hope that this translates, and I know that it will translate into us being much more sensitive and much more vigilant and helpful and in partnership with the FTC as we move forward. We've got to help solve this problem for the American consumer, and you have really been pivotal in terms of bringing us to a solution. Thank you so very much, and Godspeed to each and every one of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
The subcommittee stands adjourned.